All right, welcome to everybody live and to everybody who's going to be watching this around the world. So we're starting out right off the bat with resilience engineering, right? Resilience. Now, when I first spoke out in 2000, after some accidents NASA had in 1999, that we needed to develop a resilience engineering. We needed to be able to engineer, to understand and value the basis that contributed to resilience in systems in the aftermath of those accidents. It wasn't a popular word. There was a history. It was used in high reliability organizations. It was used in some ecological, environmental system contexts back into the 70s. So it had popped up occasionally. However, by 2006, we start to see it become popular. We start to see it become hyper-popular. Now it's hyper-popular to the power of three at least. The number of articles, last time we looked on Google, the number of articles with resilience in the title was 1 million. That was 5 years ago. Now there's no point in doing this anymore, right? Everybody wants to say resilience. What that produces is a huge amount of noise, right? A huge amount of variability, and we're going to cut through that and understand some of the fundamentals. Now, to start, it's so popular because of three things, right? Most of the people talking about it are talking about it in the context of a pressing societal need. We have extreme weather events. How do we bounce back? How do we prepare to bounce back from a disaster? Hurricane in North Carolina. Anybody notice any of the funny interconnections in the hurricane in North Carolina? Anybody notice any? You got to pay attention to events out there, right? Massive agriculture, pig factories, right? Produce large amounts of waste. When you have large amounts of flooding, you flood all that waste into the rivers and byways, polluting everything and creating a risk for disease outbreaks. So disease outbreaks are related to a hurricane. It wasn't the storm surge, it was that it stalled and dumped tons of rain inland, which creates, right, severe flooding, which moves the pollution, which creates a disease threat. So we start to see the tangled interdependencies in a complex world. So we have a pressing societal need. It happens with respect to healthcare, or aviation, dealing with a changing world, changing economic pressures and things. So they use resilience to say, oh, I need to do something in order to meet this need. Second, resilience is a pointer to fundamental scientific challenges about complexity and adaptive systems. And we're going to talk about that as the challenge of understanding the basic rules of the adaptive universe. There are many, many labels people use for this, right? I'm trying to use the most neutral, unloaded, independent of any particular engineering or social science discipline, right? The adaptive universe. It has basic rules. They're not what you think, right? And we're going to try to understand what those mean, what those are, and how you use them to explain what goes on. What are things we need to explain? How unintended consequences happen, right? We sit back, we plan, we think, oh great, if we do this, that'll lead to this, that'll lead to this, and we'll get more productivity. We'll get more efficiency. We'll get whatever, right? We'll get faster, better, cheaper. Then they find out different things happen than expected. What is that a symptom of? A symptom of complexity. Right? There's a widespread set of interdependencies and interconnections, and so the effects don't happen in a simple linear path, right? They reverberate across that network of different adaptive units, producing effects that go beyond what you anticipated, often offsetting negative ones, but sometimes actually surprising new ones that all of a sudden people jump on to take advantage of, and we'll call that a fluorescence. You'll start seeing this all on the glossary and how we build it up. So a good bit of what we're going to do is reveal to you, right, some of the answers that are emerging on the scientific challenge. The third part of this is the opportunity for engineering innovation. That a complex, interconnected world not only has huge opportunities for engineering innovation, it really requires engineering innovation. And this is critical in terms of why we're here and why we use the label engineering, resilience engineering. We use that label as a mechanism to point to the fact we want to have actionable results. We want to be able to do something about the world. We want to influence the way complex systems work. We want to steer them. And that influence isn't going to be designing one that guarantees to work. It's going to be one that says, we want to steer things in the right way for the different applications. And we're going to remind people, and probably on Friday we'll do a little remedial case on how negative feedback control systems work, and get everybody caught up to speed on some issues about what's a system and emergence and some other things. But I'll give you a simple example of steering. Right? You can design a high center of gravity vehicle for aesthetics, for load carrying capacity, for the obesity epidemic in the US or whatever. But if you design a high center of gravity car, right, it's not going to go very well around curvy roads if you have to drive fast, right? It will fall over some of the time. Right? So you have a control consequence, and we're trying to design control systems that are appropriate, right, to the context in which various activities go on given the different constraints and goals that are there. So control in engineering is a neutral word to a slightly positive word, like you would like to have a car that's steerable for the conditions in which you drive it. Right? So our results in engineering are going to be how to steer, how to understand, how to move in a dynamic space. Right? It's about how to move in a dynamic space, how to steer, how to adapt. It's not telling you, here's a solution, everybody adhere to this, everything will be great. There's no silver bullet, no magic solution, no magic wand, no free lunch. And actually, no free lunch is a theorem we'll get to. All right, so it's an opportunity and need for engineering innovation. Now, it's engineering. Why did I use the word engineering in 2000? And some of my social science friends don't, oh, engineering, well, it can't be engineering, right? And the engineering people go, I have to use social science in my engineering? Huh? What's going on? So first off is we have to have this understanding of, we're going to talk about as networks. The buzzword in the literature is complex adaptive systems, which is really a shorthand for saying I have complex networks, right, with a lot of interdependencies. We will post all the slides, right, on the site. A complex network of what? Adaptive units, right? Different units. You are an adaptive unit. Your heart's an adaptive unit. Oh, your cells are an adaptive unit, right? Oh, teams of you. A cohort, that's a class. The senior class in ISE could be thought of as a unit, right? ISE can be thought of as a unit. We have many of these units, and we'll talk about how these are different than what you think about in terms of network analysis. Right? And that's going to lead us to new ways to design, manage, and operate specific examples of these networks. Right? Whether it's with respect to communities trying to bounce back or prepare to bounce back from extreme weather events, whether it's disaster response teams, whether it's aviation trying to manage what has been a highly safe activity under changing pressures and conditions. In all of these cases, we want to be able to lead them to help them better steer through a complex, navigate the seas of complexity, as we'll say. Navigate the seas of complexity. Now, the next point is, it's not engineering in the sense of we can go to the engineering textbooks, right? It is an extrapolation, not rejecting classical engineering, but building on it in new ways to deal with the phenomena and fundamentals of complex networks of adaptive units, understanding the adaptive universe. And that requires us to draw from many different fields. So resilience engineering results from many lines of inquiry that have contributions and starts from different traditional disciplines. So you've already seen this in reading Ostrom on the tragedy of the commons and reciprocity in social systems. We'll look at Balinese water temples and what happened when Western analysts came in and said, we can up agricultural productivity if we change traditional practices, and the unintended consequences that arose because they thought linearly in a complex network situation. So we'll look at things at a social level, at a anthropological level, as examples or proof of concepts about some of the critical ideas and findings in this. But on the other hand, we're going to look at control engineering. You read Alderson and Doyle. Pretty confusing, right? So you have one thing that's like, wow, I'm doing social systems? I didn't know I'm an engineer. On the other hand, you're going, this is engineering? Holy shit, I got to do this. I got to understand this, and that doesn't even have any equations. Right? And so nonlinear systems and doing new kinds of control stuff gets hard. Right? It's the old rule about nonlinear. Even the people who do nonlinear stuff don't like doing nonlinear stuff because it makes your head hurt. But the world is not linear. Right? And so if we want to actually navigate the seas of complexity in an increasingly interconnected, pressured world, we have to be able to think about these nonlinear relationships effectively. So we're going to take stuff from these diverse traditional lines of inquiry. In that process, we are doing something that is emergent. Resilience engineering, the science behind it is emergent. It is not social science, not high reliability organizations. It takes things from high reliability organizations, right, and stimulated by that. It's not control theory in the classic sense, but it takes things from control theory and uses it. It takes things from cognitive systems, and how cognitive systems work. And you'll get another paper on that when we relate to the fundamental 3 ways that adaptive systems break down. They're very clearly understood if you think of this as distributed human and machine cognitive systems. You think of this as automation and people. It illustrates many of the principles. Is resilience engineering cognitive systems engineering? No. But it draws from it some nice things. Is it safety science, safety of complex systems? Well, in part, that's what was the starting push for us. Accidents. In other cases, it was poor response to disasters. In other cases, it was lack of ability to create sustainable environmental systems. In all of these cases, there was a kind of failure that forced people to think more broadly about the interdependencies and interconnections. So we will borrow and take from everyone. Everyone contributes. No one is excluded in providing us important inputs that we have to synthesize. But in the synthesis, something new emerges. It is not high reliability organizations. It is not organizational dynamics. It includes and speaks to that, though. Why? Because they are adaptive systems. Now, what kind of system are we dealing with here? We're going to be a little careful about trying to use the network word instead of the system word as much as possible. But in the context we're working, the level we're working with, we are dealing with, I'm going to say, systems or networks of systems that serve human purposes. Right? So if I say human system, I don't mean an organization, I don't mean management, I don't mean operators, I mean a collection of stuff that serves human purposes. So we're not going to go glycolysis. We're not going to do heart rate variability. We're not going to do how the brain, how neurocomputational models of the brain, how it adapts to frequent stimuli and also is sensitive to novel stimuli. Well, we'll use an example or two from these things. Right? But we're not going to work at that level. We're going to work at the level that's larger in terms of networks of capabilities, changing capabilities, roles, and organizations that do things that serve human purposes. And so you'll hear us use the word stakeholder. Well, it's not on your glossary list. It's not on the seeded glossary list, but some of you have taken classes know stakeholder is an important term to understand in this. And you'll see that in the things we talked through at the beginning here. All right? Next. So the slogan is, we are releasing the adaptive power of human systems. That's a nice slogan for what we're all about. Right? And we're interested in the cases where we undermine the adaptive power of human systems. Human systems are part of the adaptive universe. Right? The adaptive universe is based on a biological root, not on a physical root, but on a biological one. So we're interested in like I said, the analogies we can take with cells, with evolution, and we'll refer to examples in all of these areas. Physiological systems, neurocomputational systems, etc. So you're getting an update on an emerging and comprehensive account of how complex networks of adaptive units that serve human purposes work. How do they work? What are the rules? The technical foundations are emerging. They are technical foundations. This is the way it works. Now, our technical foundations change, right? Because we learn more, we test more, we expand, we make it more definitive. We've come up with new ways to assess and measure. right? We have come up with new ways to transfer that knowledge into engineering context so we can actually help systems, networks work better, right? But they are based on technical foundations. Sometimes the engineers get confused because the technical result, Elinor Ostrom's technical results on the tragedy of the commons, they're technical results. The engineers go, that's technical? Yeah, right? And similarly, the social scientists have to go, no, there are technical results on how control systems work, right? And how they can work, and how we can be sure they will work in future situations that we haven't seen yet. Right? Stability and control translates into something we want to use in a new way in understanding and navigating, right, the seas of complexity. Now, remember, this all comes from multiple lines of inquiry. Each of those is a community with its own social mores and approach. So the word control, if we talk to people in high reliability organizations, is a very, 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 very bad word. Because control suggests that you're trying to dominate others. You're trying to dominate uncertainty. You're trying to dominate variability. Right? And the more you try to dominate these things, they will squeeze out. And then they express surprise. I tried to dominate those people and they will do something erratic and different than I wanted. Right? And so what do? They ratchet up the pressure on compliance. So our antagonist is the compliance culture that is rife and increasing through Western modern societies. Compliance, right? And you're going to keep hearing more and more about, as you increase pressure to generate compliance, right, how it can inadvertently undermine the critical sources of resilience that make your network adaptive to changing set of demands, pressures, goals, handle goal conflicts, trade-offs, and the inevitable surprises that occur. Now, right off the bat, right, what's this network? This network is multi-role, multi-echelon, right? Echelon comes from the military language. It means layers or levels, but I like echelon. It's a good one to use, right? Multi-role, multi-echelon, right? So across these different levels or echelons and roles, we're going to talk about units, adaptive units, units of adaptive behavior we're going to get to. So right now, what I want to highlight to you is this. So the control theorist John Doyle, Alderson and Doyle, what's he interested in? How to model layered networks. How to do that in a way that we can understand what they can handle in terms of variability and disturbances, even when those variations and disturbances are ones we haven't modeled yet. We haven't experienced or understood yet. So he calls it a layered network. I want to emphasize to you that this is not neat. It's not simply hierarchical. The levels are kind of crunched. Think of it as a partly deconstructed building after a natural disaster. That would be a good metaphor, right? It's kind of there, but it's not quite all rectilinear. It's tangled by all the interdependencies. And as we seek gain, what do? We take advantage of different capabilities and changes, seeking advantage. And in the process, we increase the complexity or the tangledness, the set of interdependencies. So surprise comes at us from new directions when failures occur or new events occur and cascade in unexpected directions. So complexity refers to, when I use complexity, there's many senses and definitions of complexity. For this, we are using it as extensive and hidden interdependencies. Glossary. Complexity, extensive and hidden interdependencies. Going to come back to that over and over and over again. Tangled layered networks, right? Critical thing in your glossary. It's on the list. It's not one I filled in for you. I filled in some starters for some of you, for some of them. All right? The other thing about the adaptive universe is we're going to talk about boundaries and surprises. And we'll get to that more today. And surprise is inevitable, and everything has a boundary. So here is a tangled layered network. This is a found spaghetti diagram. If you go out and lay out interconnections, if somebody says, well, map all the interconnections, and there's people out there you can hire to do this, and they'll use a variety of different tools to look for the different interdependencies. Some of them are from my friends, right? And the idea is that, oh, I can map all of these. Here's a found one on counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. And what do you end up with? A spaghetti of relationships. Which ones matter when? How do I navigate and understand the sea of complexity? but it is an indication of what drives us, that we no longer can hide from the adaptive universe and how it works. We can no longer rely on some simplifications that say we can treat it as mostly independent parts. We can assume mostly linear interactions. And then we'll add in a few nonlinearities. We'll add in some more time variations. We'll add in a little more layer. We can add, but we'll do the simple stuff first. Right? And we're going to turn that upside down. Say, you can't even begin to understand the adaptive universe if you start simple and try to add complexity and interactions and interdependencies. It's the other way around. You have to have a set of scientific understanding, of technical foundations that handle the full complexity of an interconnected world. And then you know when to relax it, because you don't need it all the time. You don't need to use the full understanding all the time to deal with problems. Sometimes you can simplify and get away with it. Right? It can be safe to simplify for a little while, but only for a little while. And people keep thinking they can get away with this. We can relax the complexities or add them in later when we absolutely have to. And what ends up happening, right? They are continually flabbergasted by, whoops, the intervention that was supposed to be positive have negative side effects. Right? The interventions, the track record of success, we're faster, we're better, we're cheaper, our quality indicators are all going up, our safety record is great, and then we have a massive failure. It must have been those erratic people who failed to comply with our well-designed plans and systems and automation. It's always in the escape route is always, it would have been great except for those erratic human beings. So they have a perfect model of the adaptive universe as long as it stops changing and as long as you aren't in it. I don't think that's where we live. All right, you can't hide behind the linear simplifications. It has rules, and they're not what you think they are. Here's an illustration from a cartoon. Right, surprising reverberations in tangled layered networks. Notice the line at the bottom. Adaptive behavior will hijack success. You'll get some of these nice Zen statements. You should write down the Zen statement. Some of you have been in a class where I actually ran through the Zen of adaptive systems. So here's a nice one. Adaptive behavior hijacks success. So Mad Men, anybody watch Mad Men? Some idealization of the 50s. Right? All this new technology is going to lead to shorter work weeks, more time for highballs, if any of you are cocktail fans. And why they like calypso music in those days, I'm not quite sure. Right? But instead, what world do we live in? We live in a world where we have to work all the time, where we can be accessed all the time, 24-hour productivity, more squeezes, more squeezes, more squeezes. What looked like it was going to relax workload has in fact increased workload. Right? And that is actually a regularity of the adaptive universe. People will take advantage. Adaptive units will take advantage of new capabilities. The end result will be to push people in other roles, right, to work harder, work faster, work in more complex ways. It's called the law of stretched systems. And we'll get to that. Another item for your glossary, the law of stretched systems. All right, so that example. GPS. Isn't GPS great? So GPS directs lorries in England through little old English villages which don't have lanes big enough to handle big lorries. And so they get stuck like that. And you can go around in England and see signs. Ignore sat nav and engage brain. Right? So even success, right, creates new or falls into new constraints, new interconnections in ways that we didn't anticipate. All right, with that little introduction, all right, we're going to start our story of the adaptive universe with two basics. We can call these assumptions if you want. I think assumptions is not the right label because these things have to be true. Right? Every place there's finite resources. Whatever you want to deal with, whatever piece of the world you want to carve out, whatever piece of the world you're trying to model, analyze, or simulate, whatever strategies, actions, and tactics you want to put together to make things work better, or to make things safer, or guard against other kinds of failures and breakdowns. In all of these cases, everything we do is constrained by finite resources. In the biological world, finite resources dominate everything, or have to be respected all the time. Finite resources. Where can you escape from finite resources? Well, we pretend. We pretend all the time you can escape from finite resources, right? And one of the first assignments you have on CritViz is to go, whoops, find and describe cases where people think they can escape from finite resources. What's the next thing? Continuous change. Does anyone know where we can stop time? Anybody? Anybody? I'd love to go there. I'm getting older and older. I really am running out of time to find a place where they stop time. Change is continuous. That reminds us that, again, what do? We take an oversimplification that says, let's pretend it's stable. Let's pretend we're only dealing with it in a slow-paced way. Or let's freeze all the time constraints for the moment. We do this all the time. But you can't stop time. Change is continuous. Change changes. So whatever you're doing, back to that line, even if the world were perfect, it wouldn't be, from the baseball philosopher Yogi Berra, for any of you who know baseball trivia, given the World Series going on. Even if the world were perfect, it wouldn't be. Why? Because adaptive behavior hijacks success. So even if you're successful, it won't be true for long, right? Because other adaptive units will take advantage of that change to produce more change, right? To do other things, to pursue their goals. Continuous change in finite resources. So on CritViz, you're going to find an assignment, and we're going to take a break in a couple minutes, and you're going to start discussing in the groups, all right, where do you find examples where people think they can relax this and get away with it, versus the opposite, right? So the Adaptive Universe Resilience Engineering's foundations turns it around and says, you have to design a system that can deal with tempo variations. The world exists at various tempos. All right, tempos can slow down, tempos can speed up. What makes them speed up? What makes them slow down? You're going to have examples of this at different scales in high-frequency trading and the rise of IEX in flash boys, right? You've already been reading about tempo matters. So to chart adaptive cycles, we have to respect time, right, and these interactions. Keeping pace with change turns out to be a critical function in the biological sphere, the adaptive universe. Can you keep pace with change? What do we see? A bunch of things which freeze the world and leave out all tempo, leave out all the things about keeping pace with change. But they are absolutely fundamental for what we have to go through. Finite resources, right? Let's pretend we don't have finite resources. How? Computerization, right? Anybody notice failures with the cloud? Failures with critical digital services? Anybody notice the outages of airlines where the airline had to stop because the digital infrastructure didn't work? That happened in the recent months from both Delta and Southwest. No planes moved, no flight crews moved, no passengers moved. Losses were between $50 and $100 million conservatively for the two airlines individually, right? So here we see these, right? There's still finite resources in terms of even what looks like a highly empowering new technology and capability. It still depends on finite resources. Gee, I wonder where those computers are. Where are those servers that do the cloud? Right? Where are they located? You know, are they subject to extreme weather events, power outages? What's an interaction with water? Wait a minute, you can't generate power if you don't have cooling water. So if you have an extreme drought, you lose the water to run the power plants, which feed the server farms, which give you the electronic digital services that you depend on and can't work without, because you've adapted your productivity and your forms of collaboration on the assumption that that digital connectivity is there all the time. That's the interconnected, tangled, layered network of the worlds. Finite resources and continuous change. So your first thing is going to be to work through examples where we think we can relax it and get away with it, highlighting counter examples where it turns out you can't really get away with this all the time. Now, you're not going to be great at this the first pass, right? But we're going to start that process. And again, this is an example where you're going to go through iteratively on this assignment so that at the end of the year, end of the 7 weeks, you're going to have nice examples that highlight to people why you can't hide from finite resources and you can't hide from continuous change, right? That's the goal on that assignment. We got to bring the clicker next time. So, NASA, 2000, continuous change. So here's a slide from 2000. It turns out it's relevant again in 2003 after the Columbia Space Shuttle accident. So in '99, what happened was NASA had three accidents, three failures in space exploration for Mars. And NASA has always puts together an independent review so they can look at not just the superficial factors that went into it, but look deeper at the systemic and organizational factors that went into it. But circa 2000, circa 2003 for the Columbia accident, and today in surgery, today in your worlds, the jobs and companies you will join and the industries they're in, these things will be true. You are going to exist in a changing environment under new demands and pressures. There are going to be demands and pressures, and it's changing. It's not static. Here's the target on cost. Instead, it's going to be drive down costs, right? It's going to have new aggressive schedules. It's going to have new partners and relationships. It's going to have new roles. Skills are going to erode. Old skills are going to erode given these changes, and new kinds of skills will become important relative to the new roles and relationships. Old ways of doing things aren't going to work under new aggressive schedules with more cost pressures. Right? Change. Heightened public interest. New kinds of stakeholders who care, and care much more intimately about sticking their hands into how this runs. Public debates about cost of university education might reach in and grab the College of Engineering in terms of its plans for financial stability and come back and say, oh, no, from a public interest point of view, stakeholder point of view, we want to drive down the cost of education. Right? And so undercutting resources while still putting more aggressive schedules and targets for success. Right? You want to hit these for me? Thanks, Eric. Just switch the chair on the other side. Here's one we wrote out for surgery a couple years ago. Right? Continuously adapting to emerging trends and pressures for surgery. Now you think surgery is pretty straightforward, right? You know, your anatomy hasn't changed that much, right? Cutting still is cutting. Oh, wait a minute, we do have some new ways of cutting. And we can do microsurgery. We can do microsurgery with sticks. All right, we can do microsurgery with robots. Well, they're not really robots, but they change the relationships to get in and do the microsurgery. We can get increased precision in things. But what do we see? Demands for cost containment. Oh, a whole bunch of new compliance pressures for certain kinds of norms and meeting regulatory agencies, right? The medical and technology advancements. Oh, gee, are we changing in our chronic disease portfolio? Yeah, big time. Look at the NIH statistics across the country for the rise of morbid obesity or the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. Aging and demographics, change in how much major trauma they see anymore. New focuses on disease prediction and prevention, the wellness movement, more informed consumers who want a greater role in things, new demands for efficacy of the therapeutic interventions, in part driven by only do the ones that are effective and not so costly, or maximize the cost effectiveness of the interventions we do. Oh, yeah, I mean, we can run through examples like too many cesarean sections. Why do we see the rise of cesarean sections, right, when everybody says that we're doing too many? And what are this will be related to Ostrom and the tragedy of the commons. Why at one level the pressures lead people to adapt in one way to be effective, and at another level we have information that says, oh, wait, we should really be working this in a different way from an aggregate perspective. Two different perspectives, two different sets of pressures and goals, two different incompatible responses. We'll talk about this as being locally adaptive and globally maladaptive. We can see this with many other areas in healthcare as well. We can try to personalize care through new genetic and other information sources. So, quote from one of their assessments from the head of one of the surgical societies. Responses are continually demanded in a work environment that's more complex. The rate of innovation demanded it is occurring beyond our systemic capacity to document and validate. So, 2000, it's the year 2000. And what have we just had? We've had these three failures in space exploration. One of the boards, an independent board, comes back with essentially this diagnosis. Right? We can cut it all down to this. In an increasingly brittle system that resulted from being under faster, better, cheaper pressure. Pressure. If you want to understand a network of adaptive units, you have to understand the pressures. You got to track the pressures. How does one unit put pressure on another unit? How does a unit create pressure for itself in terms of its own goals, risks, right, and opportunities? Faster, better, cheaper pressure. Why do we call it faster, better, cheaper pressure? Because that was the slogan of NASA circa late 90s. We are a great organization because we can do things faster, better, cheaper. Who's NASA's boss? Anybody? Congress? Right? What's Congress always doing to NASA? Cutting their budget. Right? So how do you justify a space program when you're under budget pressure, but you've got to do these things in order to capture the imagination of the public and show there's value to these public officials so they will support you? Right? What's changed since then? Anybody think of Elon Musk? Think of anything? SpaceX? Right? We'll solve it all by privatizing space exploration or space travel, space launch. Anybody follow SpaceX? Right? Does it occasionally have disasters? Do they occasionally blow up rockets? Are you quite ready to go as a space tourist? If you had $1 billion and go as a space tourist, would it be a reliable thing to do? I think your heirs might find it a very nice thing to do because they would love a share of your $1 billion. Right? If you don't spend it all on the trip, because the risks of failure are not quite ready for tourism. Now, what's interesting here is, right, NASA recognized, right, that faster, better, cheaper pressure led them to cut corners. In fact, the people who were, after the accidents, were seen as cutting corners, before the accident were rewarded for being effective managers. Why? Because they were having a documented record of being faster, better, cheaper. What you didn't see was the way that they were undermining sources of resilience, making the system more brittle, so that when a couple other things happened, you ended up with a dramatic collapse in performance, right? The loss of the exploration vehicle or loss of contact with it. Now, of course, what do you think the reaction of the administrator was? Well, gee, NASA does engineering of complex systems. We pulled these things off. So they quickly rationalized this away. They quickly undercut the programs that we were starting up to start up resilience engineering. I found out when I was testifying to Congress in 2003 that my program was being canceled. And my partner, who was designing the replacement vehicle, had their program canceled because I couldn't do this in a laboratory. I couldn't do this with people like you. I have to do this with a real organization that's doing real things. So we had aligned the group that was responsible for the replacement vehicle for the space shuttle so that we could work with them on building resilience as a proactive way to manage the risks of operating in a complex setting under faster, better, cheaper pressure. And then, of course, what happened? 2003, we have the Columbia accident. In the run-up to it, you have a series of indicators that you're operating outside the boundaries. So here's a case. We have boundaries. We understand how space shuttle works. We understand some of the risks. We've been improving our ability to handle the risks, right? Anybody remember the tiles on the space shuttle? And the tiles were a big deal in terms of would they protect the space shuttle from debris strikes on orbit, right? And so we estimate the energy of debris strikes. We're good engineers, right? They're good engineers down there. They go and estimate the energy. They develop analytic codes, software packages that can analyze these things. They inspect the tiles after every flight. They look at the damage. They improve the tiles. They replace the tiles in better ways. Everything is getting better and more effective. Meanwhile, what happens? During launch, we have material fall off the booster rockets. There's insulating material, quote, foam. Now we're going to go back to something really hard in your past. F equals ma, right? You all remember you learned that, right? Yeah, right? So it doesn't matter whether you call it foam. The question is, The force, it depends on the mass and the acceleration. Guess what that calculation was? 2 times more than they had anticipated? No? 5 times more? 10 times? An order of magnitude more? No, 100 times more. 2 orders of magnitude. They were outside the boundaries of their well understood and analyzed envelope by 2 orders of magnitude. Also, they were having debris strikes from a different kind of debris during a different phase of flight, outside the anticipated envelope that they had designed and considered in terms of risks. Oh, and by the way, because it was different stuff hitting the orbiter at a different phase of flight, it was hitting different parts of the orbiter. And I asked the board to come up with why everyone thought this leading edge structure of the wing, which is where the hole was, where the foam hit on the edge of the wing, why that was more structurally sound than the rest of the orbiter. We could not find anything in the technical documentation that indicated why people had this misplaced overconfidence in the strength of the leading edge structure, which is different than the other parts of the vehicle and the way it was protected and the way it was strengthened. Right? They were outside the envelope on every dimension, and yet the guy comes back to say it's safe to fly with no new concerns or added risk. Why? Because he was under production pressure. Right? They were already behind schedule for supporting developments of the International Space Station. Right? And if they kept going, and every time they had a discrepancy or a problem or anomaly, they slowed down schedule, they would be further and further behind. And there'd be more pressure from Congress and more pressure from other stakeholders. Right? And so the only way to deal with that pressure is say, we can discount. And that's not really a concern. In fact, you won't even send it to the people who had the expertise to analyze these things or commission the effort to analyze these things. Why? Because if I ask somebody to analyze it, if I call it an anomaly and ask them to analyze it, they'll spend time and money to do that, and the result might delay the schedule. And once they come out with a finding, I can't discount it anymore because we had an analysis that gave me the wrong answer. So better not to even start the analysis process, but pretend my personal analysis as a manager who is an expert on these issues was sufficient. And present it in a nice PowerPoint so everybody thought I had done an analysis. And I had talked to the relevant specialists and experts when I hadn't at all. Right? We're going to see this discounting under faster, better, cheaper pressure happen all the time. Faster, better, hit it again. Right? Boom. And so we'll talk, and this highlights too is the trade-offs. So one of the fundamental concepts we're going to start laying out and understanding in our work on resilience engineering is what does it mean to act in the face of trade-offs? How do you manage trade-offs? Right? Normally we're efficient. How do you know when to value thoroughness instead of being efficient all the time? Right? It's not having the one place on the trade-off function. Right? We should be this value efficiency this much versus thoroughness this much. It's your ability to change where you are on the curve. And what we're really interested in is what we'll call the architecture question. For sustained adaptability, you read the 4 senses of resilience. For sustained adaptability, it's an architecture question. What's the architecture question? The architecture question is, how does the system find good operating points in a multidimensional trade space? Right? So we can't relax trade-offs. Finite resources and continuous change leads to trade-offs. So your glossary is going to need to start laying out some of the different kinds of trade-offs, right? How they're multidimensional, how this stuff works. Because you have to talk to people about trade-offs. There's no free lunch in the face of trade-offs. There's no one operating point you can just design for. Adaptive systems that can sustain that capability over long cycles, right, have to be able to move where they are in a multidimensional trade space. By the way, if you're a mathematical aficionado, there's math for this, right? We won't do it. I don't understand it either. But there's math.